Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of the podcast. I'm here with Lieutenant Colonel Kirkland, and today we are going to talk about what to do if you are a homeschooler.
This is going to be a great episode because both you and I, when we went to the Air Force Academy in West Point, had classmates, roommates, and other people that we knew at the academies that were homeschooled. Homeschoolers are an important part of the academy as well as our officer corps, and being able to understand their particular situations and how they can improve their application to get into a service academy is important.
Without further ado, let's jump right into how you can make yourself as strong a candidate as possible for the service academies and ROTC scholarships if you are a homeschooler. I want you as a homeschooler who's listening to this to think about how can you plan ahead and the motivation that you're going to need throughout the entire application process, throughout all of your time in high school, really, because that's when the academies start looking at you. And sir, what are the three things that we always look at when we're breaking down how to get into your service academy or earn a scholarship?
Well, there's this acronym that was put out by a former commanding general of Army ROTC that has stuck for probably 30 years. The acronym is SAIL, stands for Scholar, Athlete, and Leader. And it was originally used for Army ROTC, but now is pretty much applicable across both academies and ROTC. And so what we'd like to do today is break it down into the Scholar, Athlete, Leader model, in that the particular concerns that homeschoolers should have in the Scholar, Athlete, Leader categories, because that's what ROTCs and the academies are looking for in the people that they give scholarships to and the applicants that they admit to service academies. And I'll let you kick it off with Scholar, which is probably the most important as far as percentage-wise in the whole candidate score. So let's talk about Scholar.
If we think about the percentage of the whole candidate score, it's about 60%. And 20% of that comes from your high school. So if you are homeschooled, this means that there are some steps that you need to take to be as most prepared as possible for your application. And one of those means placing a higher emphasis on your SAT/AC score, because it's about 40% for the academies, a little bit more or less depending on which ROTC scholarship you're applying for, but those tests just become more important. So really something that you need to start prioritizing. Some people take the test as early as sophomore year, but you need to have Algebra 2 down to in the SAT, ACT math portions of these tests. So that's something to think about when you're planning out your high school schedule. You need to be through Algebra 2 to really excel at the SAT, ACT. So let's talk a little bit more about the requirements for the academics.
Great roll up here, what you just talked about with the 40% breakout with the SAT or ACT and the 20% high school grades, rigor of your high school, in other words, how competitive your high school is, and class rank. If you're a homeschooler, they really can't measure the competitiveness of your high school because you're not really going to high school. And you're not being ranked in class, so they really can't look at that either. So that's why any standardized measure of things that you do as a homeschooler, where you're compared against students that are already going to a high school, is an important thing. So you're talking about SAT or ACT. Of course, we're talking about AP, advanced placement courses, dual enrollment with colleges or universities near where you are. And that dual enrollment can also be online school too. BYU has a dual enrollment. Colorado State Global also has a high school portion where you're enrolled in college at the same time. So anytime you're doing things where your performance can be measured directly with someone who's in a brick and mortar high school is an important way that you can be in that 20% where it's not just your grades, but you've been measured objectively against other candidates. Let's talk about courses you should be taking in high school. Of course, just like you would at a regular high school, you take your 4 years of English, focusing on writing, 4 years of math to making sure that you at least have pre-calculus by your senior year, 3 to 4 years of social studies and science, 4 years with biology, physics, chemistry. And then if you can get to your fourth year with an AP chemistry or college chemistry with lab, and then a couple of years of a foreign language. So all of those are things that you should be taking as a homeschooler.
And let's talk a little bit about specifics for those classes. When you look at teacher recommendations and evaluations, the requirements are for every academy, you have to have a math and you have to have an English evaluation for your teachers. So when you're thinking about, am I going to pursue some sort of dual enrollment or AP, math and English are really good options to consider, especially junior year. I'm going to find a teacher who's going to be able to write me an evaluation outside of my parents, because your parents can complete the evaluation, but they're already going to be completing the counselor forms. So if you have an outside perspective of someone who's willing to advocate for you on your behalf because you were in a dual enrollment class, that's a really good opportunity. And so that involves some planning. You have to plan for this, but it's better to have that planned out in advance and be ready to go into that pre-calc class your junior year, or even calculus if you're that advanced in math by the time you're a junior. So those are some considerations to think of. Another option is if you want to complete the lab, the academies love to see physics and chemistry with labs. So taking those on a dual enrollment or an AP version of those is also highly recommended.
And even like labs these days, you can do labs online. It's so sophisticated these days where you don't even actually have to be in a laboratory like you and I were when we were in high school. You can actually do all of the things you need to do in an online environment. So there's just so much more flexibility today to allow you to do, things that in the past just weren't possible. Really, there's no reason why you can't get all of the training and background you need, even online.
Definitely, sir. And your parents are going to be submitting your transcript. There's a few requirements that have to be on your transcript if it's not coming from a public or a private high school. So in addition to like the typical things, the class title, the grade, you actually have to submit more detail than the traditional student. And that's going to be the description of the course, but then also the reference materials that were used in teaching you. That includes like the edition number of whatever textbook that you are using. And that all needs to go on your transcripts. And you're looking at core classes and you're trying to choose your curriculum throughout high school. That's something for your parents to help you decide is which math class, which English class, which science class you're going to take based on the core, and making sure that the course curriculum and descriptions of the courses lead into your time at the academies.
Yeah, and that's why a dual enrollment, online dual enrollment, as you progress through high school, can take away that requirement to have to be able to just give a lengthy descriptions and text materials and things like that. I really don't know exactly the numbers, but I would think that given the amount of dual enrollment that is available now in all sorts of different learning modes, that's something that if you haven't looked into yet, you should be looking into strongly.
And, and one more thing to add on to the scholar side of the house, we're thinking about stratifying you against your peers, comparing you to your peers as much as possible. So SAT, ACT scores are global. So are AP scores. So if you take an AP class your junior year and you take the test and you're able to submit that. Now, it's not going to count for senior year because it's going to be too late. By the time for admissions purposes, they're really not going to consider if you take AP Calculus senior year and then in May or June, you take the AP test. The decisions are already made at that point. So really you want to prioritize any AP classes and AP exams that you're taking junior year.
Yeah, great point there, that there's a timing issue there too. Anything you can do that measures you against someone going to a brick and mortar high school is important on the front regarding scholar piece of that. Any of those measures, SAT, ACT, which of course is required, and AP and any other sort of standardized measure is helpful.
Great. Let's move on to the second portion of the scholar athlete leader. So the athlete perspective. And sir, about how many students at the academies have some sort of athletic participation?
Well, it's pretty high. I mean, 95% of candidates have participated in sports, high school sports or sports in your own, and 80% have earned varsity letters. So you see that the participation is very, very high. If you're not doing sports in high school, you're pretty much an outlier. That makes it maybe more challenging for homeschoolers. Would you agree?
I would, and I even like to think about it if you live in a competitive congressional district and you're applying for a nomination for the academies and your member of Congress sees that you have not played any sports, you might be at risk of not getting the nomination because they might seriously doubt whether or not you're going to be able to keep up athletically compared to the other candidates that are captains of teams, have multiple varsity letters. So, something to be aware of is, are you in a competitive district if you're a homeschooler? And then what are some tactics that you can do to prove that you have some athleticism? Well, the first one is you can join a high school team. Just because you're homeschooled, but you can still reach out to a public high school close to you and see if you're able to join. This is state dependent. Not all states allow this. It really does depend on where you live, but just reaching out to your local high school and asking the question is the first place you want to start.
Another thing you can do is if your state will allow you to do that is to ask a private high school if you can participate. There may be some costs involved with that. There may be some waivers you have to sign, but we've heard of candidates who actually ask a local private school if they can participate.
Okay, so let's say you live in a state where you cannot join a local high school, or maybe there's the high schools close to you don't have teams. There's some cities where there's not a lot of opportunities to participate in sports. What do you do then, sir?
So you got to find local teams, club teams. Like there's some sports where in your high school you might not have a team. In my high school, we didn't have a swim team because we didn't have a pool. So if you want to be a good swimmer, you'd had to do it on your own. Things like gymnastics, where there's very few high schools that have a gymnastics team, but you oftentimes have to go to a local gymnastics facility in order to be able to compete. But I tell you what, the competition of the swim team and the gymnastics teams that compete at the local and state level are like off the charts difficult. There's a number of sports that fall into that category where it's seriously competitive doing that outside. So I think what you want to do is you really want to seek out, if you can, and seek out early, meaning not as a junior or senior in high school, but as in your middle school or getting ready to go to high school, getting better at those kind of sports and joining competitive sports outside of your high school so that by the time you're a junior or senior, you're competing at a high level. And the academies know that. They have people at brick and mortar high schools that are level 7 or level 8 gymnasts, or they are on the club swim team and they're doing really, really well. And so the academies and ROTCs understand that that certainly is possible and oftentimes required if you want to excel in that sport.
Some other options are club basketball, club baseball, club lacrosse, tennis. And then if you're interested in running, you can always go out and run 5K, 10K races. But the biggest thing is when you're competing at the club level to try and get in some sort of competition so you can prove it. And if you don't have the ability to letter, you can at least say, here's what I was able to achieve by playing this sport, or here's how I helped my team. We won this tournament because of my contribution to the team. And some of these teams even have team captain positions. So you could even have a leadership role on a club team as well.
And that's it. What we're talking about is teams. So rather than just say doing a 5 or 10K race on your own or doing something athletically on your own, the emphasis is with team sports and with being a part of a team, because both ROTCs and the academies believe that you get a lot of benefit from being a member of a team, being able to work as a teammate, being able to support each other, and that there's life lessons that only can be learned if you are in a sport and you have teammates.
This all goes back to everything we talk about, the emphasis of the team over I, how you've helped your team, how you've supported your team, not what you were able to accomplish, but what your team was able to accomplish together.
Yeah, exactly. Then the other thing is obviously doing well on the CFA, right? Too. So continuing to understanding what the standards are for this candidate fitness assessment for the academies, or the push-ups, sit-ups, and run or plank or pull-ups, depending upon which ROTC program you're applying to. And I think that's also a good way for homeschoolers to reinforce to the academies and to ROT that you're in good physical shape. is to be able to excel at the CFA and other fitness tests that are given by the ROTCs. Just keep on trucking with that too.
A lot of athletes assume that they're going to knock the fitness assessment, whichever fitness test you're taking, out of the park. Do not wait to see how you perform on one of those fitness tests. Don't wait until the month before you need to test. Take a practice test now. And we have resources for that, which we will link to in the show notes for this episode. But find out where you're at, because if you're a gymnast, maybe your run time is really poor. Or if you are a tennis athlete, maybe you can't do a lot of pull ups. Whatever sport, you have weaknesses. It's really important to find out what those weaknesses are early so you can practice and improve.
Absolutely. So let's talk about leadership now.
Definitely, sir. And I think you have the opportunity to be a leader on your sports team. So, like you said, if you get involved early, you could be a team captain. There's nothing that's preventing you from being a team captain at your local high school, even if you're homeschooled, if you start practicing that sport in middle school or earlier.
Yeah, establishing that, being a part of the team long term. Not going to be able to go in as a high school junior and then become the team captain for people that have been participating in the sports since middle school. It's just the reality of it.
Sir, outside of sports, what are some other leadership opportunities for students?
There's just so many opportunities. When you look at a brick and mortar high school, you're looking at things like student government, class president, class vice president. There's clubs and things you can do in your high school, but there's so many opportunities to lead and to show your leadership outside of high school, outside of a brick and mortar high school. And so there's just tons of stuff. Community service, where you're doing something in your local community to lead others and to improve your community. There's so many of these types of organizations out there. Church groups, leadership in church groups, church youth group, things like that. I think of things like junior achievement, things like scouting, and local theatrical productions, band, orchestra, all of those things. They need leaders. They need high schoolers who care about their community, who care about their church, who care about leading others. And there's just such a vacuum of leadership that it's just out there for your taking to lead others and to do something that can impact your community.
I would even add that it's a really good opportunity to start exploring what interests you and try and find volunteer opportunities in those interests. Scouting is just such a great example because it allows you to practice some of the military skill sets that you'll be using, but worked with a lot of candidates who volunteer at the VA. There's some places that won't let you volunteer if you're under 18, but there's some that will if you are under 18. And if you're there long enough, you can take on a leadership role, and then you're interacting with veterans and you're able to communicate and talk to all these different veterans from all these different eras. And it's just fascinating experience. And then one of the big ones is developing military propensity through Civil Air Patrol, Sea Cadets, or Young Marines. So that's another option for our young people out there. And sir, what was your experience with Civil Air Patrol?
That was great. Yeah, we've got a podcast on Civil Air Patrol, which was done a couple of years ago. We had a really great hour-long conversation about Civil Air Patrol, but that was a defining point in my life. I mean, in middle school, I had a friend, Dave Kowalski, who kept asking me to join Civil Air Patrol. And I didn't know anything about the military. My dad was in the Army Reserve, but I really wasn't really inclined towards the military. And he kept bugging me. And one day I went and checked out a meeting and loved it. That pretty much changed the trajectory of my life. Then I became more inclined towards military, but I really developed leadership and advancing into ranks of Civil Air Patrol over the time that I had in high school. And so these organizations like Sea Cadets, Young Marines, Civil Air Patrol are just invaluable towards developing your military propensity, learning about the military, but also giving you an opportunity to lead others.
Yeah, especially if you start early enough and you have the opportunity to be a senior leader in your unit. That's where you're leading 20, 30, 40 young men and women. What a great opportunity. But I think something that we should really stress here is that if you're in high school, a public high school, it's fairly easy to get involved. And it might not be as easy if you're homeschooled but you might have to go out of your way a little bit more so than if you were a traditional high school student. So it's up to you. You have to be motivated. You might have to travel distances to participate in some of these activities. It might take a lot of extra time out of your schedule, but it's something that you have to be diligent about and pursue to make sure that you are putting yourself into the types of situations that the academies and ROTC are looking for in their future officer candidates.
Absolutely. It's not going to be one where you're in your brick and mortar high school and then there's a club and all you have to do is just stay after school to be part of that club. You have to go on out and actually find it and make it happen. That shows a lot for a young person who goes out and specifically gets involved in these organizations where it's not easy and then to be able to do that.
Definitely. And you stand out a little bit more so than some of the traditional high school students who are just varsity athletes, and that's really all they have. If you've taken the time to get involved in community organizations, that stands out to the interviewers too. So your liaison officer and your congressional nomination panel, if you're applying to the academies or to the officer that's interviewing you for the scholarship, they're going to notice, wow, this person's really taken the time to get involved in their community and they care about their community because that's what they're looking for in officers. They want officers who are going to take care of their soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, guardians for the Space Force.
And then it also, for your interviews, it allows you to talk about many different experiences, like you said. And then it also allows you to have a lot of different choices for letters of recommendation for either ROTC or the academies to be able to draw from just a wide variety of different people and different leaders and different adults who can talk about your achievements in many different things that you've done. So oftentimes, I think with homeschoolers, you have too many people to choose from. So you got to really choose your letters of recommendation carefully to make sure that they're making the impact that you want them to make.
Certainly. Sir, if you could summarize what advice we have for homeschoolers, what would you tell them?
Yep. So scholar, right, which is 60%, right, your academics in your high school. Put emphasis on the SAT or ACT and strive to do testing in high school that matches you against someone going to a brick and mortar high school. The more that you can show that you stand out compared to someone who's at a brick and mortar high school and that you have exceeded the standard is exactly what you want to do. So I'd say that scholar, that's the emphasis that you want to have here. Of course, what we talked about earlier, mirroring a typical college prep curriculum. And then I would say for athletics, trying out a different sports early to see where you excel and doing it early so that you can build up your athletic prowess, as we might say, so that when you become a junior or senior high school and you're applying for the service academy or you're applying for an ROTC scholarship, that you'll have achievement in those sports. And then finally, with leadership, getting involved and taking on leadership roles in your community, Boy Scouts, Girl State, Junior Achievement, being involved in military propensity organizations like Civil Air Patrol, Sea Cadets, and Young Marines. So a lot of this is really your own initiative that you have to take in order to be able to, show that you're that scholar athlete leader that the ROTCs and the service academies are looking for. So what did I miss there, Trish?
I think you covered it all really well.
Okay. Well, good. The final thing that we talked about before this session is where you live, because if you're a homeschooler and you have the opportunity to live anywhere, if you're in a very competitive congressional district, you may want to consider, if you can, and you're able to do so, to move to a less competitive congressional district. So that's another kind of advantage to being a homeschooler, particularly if you're mobile in your ability to be able to decide where you live. So you're not like tied to a certain geographical area, at least from the point of being a homeschooler. That may be different for your parents who have to work in a certain area, but there's also that opportunity to kind of do geographical arbitrage in regards to where you live and whether the congressional district is competitive or not.
Great point, sir.
And we talk about that in previous podcasts about congressional districts, competitiveness of congressional districts, and how your chances of getting into a service academy, in particular, where you live, is important. I would state, though, that for ROTCs, it really doesn't matter where you live for ROTCs. That specific last point was about service academies.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode, and we hope that all of our homeschoolers out there have learned a little bit and can apply this to their future applications for both academies and ROTC scholarships. We'll see you next time.